Hello, I am Mikayla and I'm here with my partner Justine. And for this video, we will be talking about three books from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, Nicomachean Ethics is considered an esoteric work because it was initially written as Aristotle's notes or his students' notes from his lectures. Basically, they were meant for Aristotle's personal use or for his students' use and other specialists. We start off with book 1, which attempts to define the subject matter itself. And then book 2 tackles moral virtue, while book 10 or the last book for Aristotle's book tackles pleasure and happiness. Now let's proceed to a closer discussion of the chapters of each book. Chapter 1 starts with Aristotle's inquiry by contemplating what is good. He says that everything aims at what is good, and it differs according to what activity or what field the person is working in. For example, in military leadership, the end would be victory. For medicine, the end would be health. For shipbuilding, the end would be the ship itself or the vessel. And for economics, the end would be wealth. And another example of this is bridle making. So a horse bridle is the headgear used for horses, which then leads to horsemanship or training of horses. And once horses are trained, they can be used for warfare. And then that then leads to generalship. So basically, making a bridle aims at something that is good, and then another good, and then it leads to another good. And Aristotle says that the absolute best ones are the ends that um, are at the end of the cycle. So for example, generalship in this example, because the previous processes only exist for the sake of it. Now in chapter 2, Aristotle talked about finding the highest human good. And he said that the best good would be something that we wish and we work for as an end in itself and not a part of that unending cycle. And according to Aristotle, the best good would be something that governs all knowledge and that teaches us how to think. And he says that the science of human good is politics because it tells us what to do and what not to do. And it encompasses other noble arts such as strategy, economics, and rhetoric. Since the ends of the political art include the ends of other sciences, then it must be the highest human good. He also introduces the concept of an individual and the state, that while the individual is important, the state or the city is so much more worthy, meaning that while an end is worthy to attain for just one person, it is more godlike to attain it for a nation. But this makes us think, can we say the same for our politicians who put themselves first before our nation? Now we move on to chapter 3, where Aristotle says that his inquiry will just be a little bit general and he won't go into specifics. He said that he will be giving a rough outline and we should listen to him just like how we listen to our teachers. He says that we can only be a good judge of something if we know it well, which is why younger people are awful students of politics because they haven't experienced anything in life yet. Now, it's important to note that this happened during the time where there was no formal education or Google, and there were mostly just two ways to gather information, which is to listen to teachers like Aristotle, and the other is to get practical experience. If Aristotle could see the youth now and how much information we could gather just by the click of our hands, could he still say the same thing? Aristotle also said that young people are just very passionate and they're very keen on taking action rather than acquiring knowledge, which makes them immature. Now, for chapter 4, Aristotle says that the highest good is happiness. Now, if I ask you what makes you happy, you'd probably come up with an answer that is a little bit different or quite different from the rest of us. If I say that sleeping makes me happy or eating good food makes me happy, then even though some of us may have some similarities, it actually can also mean something that is different to each one of us. Now, Aristotle says that everybody says that the highest good is happiness, but other people could say it's health, wealth, or education, and this is heavily based on how we were brought up as children. So he says that we have to begin with things that are known to us, and it's best if we have been brought up in such a way that we know what things are good for us. We know what just things are good for us. Now, he says that if we haven't been brought up in that manner, we shouldn't be scared because we can still learn from teachers like him. But if we don't listen to teachers like him, then we're pretty much out of luck. Now, in chapter 5, he discusses the three kinds of life: the life of pleasure, political life, and contemplative life. So, the life of pleasure, he says, is a slave to the senses, and political life is slave to honor, which he says is very superficial because he says that it's like you're looking for validation from other people. And lastly, the life of inquiry is contemplated life. Now, in chapter 6, he asks, what is the universal good? But he actually settles with the idea that there's no universal or common good, that it's not possible. For example, there are many categories of good sciences. Like in illness, the good science would be medicine. In war, the good science would be military leadership. But it differs according to circumstance. So it's not really possible that there is just one idea of good. And he then likens this inquiry to the fact that an individual is both one unique person and part of a human race. And good can also be specific and general in that way. We still have a lot of questions here, but Aristotle says that if there's even one idea of good, it wouldn't be practical to know anyway, because even if doctors or carpenters know that there's an ideal good, it wouldn't help them in their everyday life. Let's now move on to the other chapters in Book 1, which will be discussed by Justine.
Thank you, Mikay. So for the chapter 7, we will be talking about the best good and the function of man in it. According to Aristotle, whether or not the universal good exists, the end of each science aims for a good thing. For example, the end of food processes is food production. The end of studying is learning or earning a diploma. And this is all good things. And there are a lot of other good things in the world. So according to Aristotle, there must be one best good, and this one best good must be complete, self-sufficient, and choice-worthy. And Aristotle concluded that all these characteristics converge to happiness, because for him, happiness is complete. We choose it for the sake of it, which is happiness for itself and not for other things. Happiness is self-sufficient. It is enough. It can stand on its own. And happiness is choice-worthy because it is not just a one good thing. Happiness is a lot of good things taken together. We humans always choose happiness. So, what is happiness? Aristotle settled for a definition that happiness is an active life associated with reason and virtue. Hence, happiness is not it's not a virtue. It is an activity, a human work. So, good has something to do with the activity of the soul in accordance to virtue and reason, and all of these things are wrapped to the praise called complete life, and which mostly reached by adults. Tulad nga ng sinabi ni Mikay kanina, ang mga kabataan or the young people are not yet that experienced. Hence, they are not yet have reached the complete life or considered happy. So a happy man lives a complete life. So for the chapter 8, Aristotle mentioned the three types of good things: the external good, the goods of the soul, which is our morals, the good of the body, which is our intellect, and among all those things, those belongs on the soul are considered the most highest and the fullest goods of all. So, since happiness is the highest good thing, a happy man lives a good, noble, and virtuous life. And aside from that, happiness also needs external goods to be able to be happy, such as the political power, wealth, children, and friends, in order to use them to reach the end and be happy. Next. I'm sorry. There you go. So for the next 4 chapters, Aristotle raised questions about happiness that he also provided an answer. So for chapter 9, he asked, is happiness acquired by learning or habituation or sent by God? Or perhaps it is by chance? First, Aristotle says that happiness is divine, so it can be sent by God. And hence, that's why there are people who we call who are blessed. For instance, meron tayong kakilala or nakitang tao na ang galing niya, ang bait niya, gumagawa siya ng mabuti lagi, and sasabi na lang natin, wow, ang blessed ng taong to. So for the second one, happiness can also be acquired through learning and education. That's why Aristotle has focused on teachers teaching or having someone adult mostly or well and very informed to teach the young how to live a happy life. And for the third one, happiness comes from our effort. And the 10th chapter, it was asked, should no man be called happy while he lives? Aristotle takes on this on Solon, who mentioned that only the dead people are the one who are truly happy, which is in practical sense, it has a point because a person cannot be truly happy if he or she haven't yet completed life and there are no more bad things that will happen to him or her. However, this doesn't mean that we can consider a living person happy. According to Aristotle, a person who engages to virtuous activities will always be happy because of his or her blameless deeds. So, however, on the other hand, a happy person who suffers to a catastrophic event before he or she died, this person may not be entirely happy. So, to be a happy person is considered who have lived a happy life, live in virtue, and died in a reasonable way. So, for the 11th chapter, do fortunes of the living affect the dead? During their time, there was a belief that whenever the person die, he or he or her happiness may be affected by whatever happens to the people that he left. How Aristotle finds this absurd because he thinks that it is ridiculous that everything that this person did in his life to be happy will only just be affected by the people that he left. However, Aristotle still believes that the person is affected by what happens to their descendants and friends, but the effect can be unnoticeable. So for the 12th chapter, um, is happiness something to be praised or honored? According to Aristotle, virtuous activities such as courage and justice is praised or being praised. And while happiness is divine and can be almost related to the gods, it should be honored. Next. So for the third chapter, since Aristotle defined happiness as the soul in accordance with virtue and reason, let's talk about the soul. So the soul has two parts, the non-rational one and the rational one. And the non-rational soul has also two parts, the nutritive one. And the nutritive one is the one that we have that makes us less distinct human because every other things has this one, nutritive or growth. Plants grow, animals grow, we grow. So that's the first part of non-rational soul. And the second one is the thing that fights with reason. And if we were not careful, we can be swayed to the wrong path. And these are our impulse and desires. However, non-rational soul can be swayed by reason if we listen to the person who knows better. That we will be talking about on the two parts of rational soul. There are two parts of rational soul. First is the reason. This is the something that we already have on our own. And the second one is our ability to listen to the good advice and reliable people. And finally, these divisions of our soul and the divisions of the soul makes it the division also have the division of virtue, which is the moral one, which also refers to our uh, person's character, and the intellectual one, which is our intellect capacities or capabilities. More of We will talk more about virtue on the second book of Nicomachean Ethics will be presented by Mikay in the next video.
We will now move on to intellectual and moral virtue, which will be discussed in Book 2. So intellectual virtue is the result of education, which requires experience, whereas moral virtue is the result of habits. And Aristotle expounds on this by saying that moral habits or moral virtues and habits have the same root word, ethike and ethos. So this further proves that moral virtues are not natural. Rather, they're something that we acquire over habituation. And although we have the capacities innate in us, we were born with these capacities. Without training or repeatedly doing things, good things, we cannot acquire it or we cannot be virtuous. And this is the aim of legislators who create laws. So they want to create good citizens by habituating them to follow the law. And he also further emphasizes that we need teachers because we are not born good or bad. And upbringing is also important because it becomes second nature for us to do good things. In chapter 2, he then discusses that one must avoid excess and defect and aim for the mean. So for example, the mean is courage. Being too brave would mean that someone is reckless, but being fearful of everything would mean that someone is a coward. Now, if we have to search always for the mean of things to become good persons and act with virtue. For chapter 3, he discusses how moral virtue has a connection with pleasure and pain. He says that we need to feel pleasure and pain for the right things. And the combination of upbringing, experience, and reason can teach us what acceptable behaviors there are. It is harder to fight against pleasure than anger, which is why the good is better when it is harder. And good things happen when we do something that is hard for us. We move forward with chapter 4, where Aristotle lists down the conditions needed to possess virtue and act from it. For example, someone who produces a lovely artwork, that person will then be labeled as a good artist. But virtues are not the same with the arts, for it is not the end product that is just important. The state of the person matters as well. For example, I say something that is grammatical, that doesn't mean that I am a grammarian. So Aristotle says that one must have knowledge, one must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes, and one must choose his action and proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. He has to behave virtuously many times in order to make it a reflex or a habit. Aristotle then tackles what is virtue. In chapter 5, he says that it's part of the soul, so it might be passion, it might be a capacity, or it might be a characteristic. He says that passions are something that we feel or associate with pleasure and pain. So for example, desire, anxiety, fear, or joy. But he says that we are not blamed or praised for our passions, but we are blamed and praised for the good things and the bad things that we do. So it's not passion. For capacities, capacities are our capacity to feel joy, our capacity to feel empathy. While capacities are innate in us, virtues are not. So we have to learn virtue to habit, as I've said before. So it's not a capacity. So in the end, Aristotle settles that it is indeed a characteristic, since it is in our characteristics that we hold the potential to behave well or badly. And in chapter 6, he tackles how virtue is a disposition to choose the intermediate or choose the mean. And he further explains that the mean is relative to us. For example, I eat 1 cup of rice on average every day. And this will be different for another person who eats half a cup of rice on average, or 1.5 cups of rice on average. And he then explains how the defect or the deficiency and the excess are both called vices, whereas the mean is called the virtue or the good thing. Virtue can also be an extreme, which means that it can be the extreme of doing well. And lastly, he says that evil stuff is just evil. So there is no mean for that. There's no mean for adultery, theft, or murder. They're just really bad things. He also lists down some more specific examples of virtues and their excess and deficiency in chapter 7, because he wants to prove that it's not just a general idea, it can also apply to individual facts. So for example, in money, liberality will be the mean, the deficiency would be stinginess, and the excess would be prodigality or extravagance. Now, in chapter 8, he says that the extremes are opposed to each other and the mean. So first, both extremes are extremely opposed to one another. However, the mean has some likeness between each extreme because they have something in common with the mean. So for example, recklessness has a bit of courage in it. And he also explains how recklessness is not as hated as cowardice in society. And this may be because the extreme of recklessness is much closer to the mean, which is courage, than cowardice. And this is possibly because we incline towards one extreme than the other. And in chapter 9, in the last chapter of book 2, he says that the mean is really hard to attain, and it takes a lot of work and real education to figure out if one should do good things or one is going to do bad things. And this is why so many people perform badly, or this is why so few people behave well. And lastly, public perception of what the mean is can also vary, which is why it's harder for us to determine what is the mean. We will now proceed to chapter 10, which will be discussed by Justine.
So there you go. For the book 10, Pleasure and Happiness, it is the last book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And this book is divided into 9 chapters or sections. And for the first 5 chapters, we will be talking about pleasure. So for the chapter 1, it was discussed in here that some thinkers argues that pleasure is the ultimate good, while other thinkers said pleasure is evil. On the screen, we will be seeing the 2 opposing views about pleasure, which is first, pleasure is when we enjoy the kind of things we should, as long as they are in the right amounts. And the second one, it was said or advised that we must avoid pleasure because they may destroy our virtue. Hence, in the chapter 2, Eudoxus, a contemporary of Aristotle and a student of Plato, stated that pleasure is the ultimate good because all creatures seeks pleasure and pleasure avoids pain. However, Plato stated that pleasure must be combined with wisdom to be an ultimate good. However, if you can remember what we have discussed in the book 1, an ultimate good doesn't need to be combined with anything. So next slide, please. Thank you. So for the chapter 3, we will be talking about the negative views on pleasure. And first, it was said that pleasure is the replenishment of pain, hence it is not complete and it is not whole. And second one, it was also stated by critics that all pleasures are disgraceful. Aristotle thinks that these arguments are inappropriate because indeed pleasure is not the ultimate good, and not all pleasure are desirable, but there are superior and desirable pleasures. Hence, in chapter 4, Aristotle continues to justify pleasure and eventually defining it. So pleasure is, according to Aristotle, is whole and complete. And pleasure, we can feel pleasure when we perceive something dark, something horrible, and something rotten, something dirty, because pleasure only happens when we perceive good and noble. Hence, the person and the object must be good to have pleasure. And according to Aristotle, pleasure is something that pleasure is the happy completion of everything that we do. For example, we play piano, we eat chocolate, read the book, and we feel pleasure about it. So this statement negates the claim that all pleasure are disgraceful dahil may mga bagay tayong ginagawa na hindi naman disgraceful, but we can feel pleasure from them. So next slide, please. So in the chapter 5, it was stated here that pleasure takes in different form depending on the activities that we do, tungkol na mga nasabi ko kanina. And some pleasure can distract us. And hindi lang ang mga disgraceful na pleasure ang nakaka-distract sa atin. Sometimes, neutral pleasures can distract us. Halimbawa na lamang ang paggamit ng phone. For instance, when we are studying, phone is not necessarily a disgraceful pleasure, but it distracts us from studying. Hence, there are 2 types of pleasure. First, these are the pleasure from our favorite activities such as tulad ng bagay ko kanina, pagbabasa ng libro, pagdidilig ng halaman, pag-aalaga ng pets. And the other kind of pleasure are the alien pleasure. Basically, these are all the things that are anything na hindi that does not come from our favorite activities. Hence, it it was also stated in here that pleasures are related to activities. And some activities are wicked or shameful, kaya nagkakaroon ng disgraceful pleasure. So, paano nga ba natin malalaman kung ano ang good pleasure sa hindi good pleasure? According kay Aristotle, ang advice niya is, we must follow the good, the just, and the happy man around to always know kung ano nga ba yung mga good pleasure. So, in the chapter 6 onwards, we will be talking about happiness. And in the chapter 6, quick recap, happiness is an activity and it is not a virtue. And this activity must be associated with virtue. And then, dito, mapapatanong naman tayo kung ano nga ba yung mga activity na magdadala sa atin ng happiness. And again, sagot ni Aristotle, we must look at the virtuous person to figure out what's the best activity. And Aristotle takes happiness a very serious takes happiness as a serious activity. Pero according then kay Aristotle, we can also do some relaxations by amusement. Pero hence the pleasure of play. Pero hindi natin siya dapat sobrahan because we must only take the relaxation as the activity and not the end. So next slide please. So, ayan. So in chapter 7, sinagot ni Plato dito kung ano nga ba ang best activity that will provide the happiness. And he answered here that the best activity is the contemplative life. And according to Aristotle, Aristotle encouraged us to embrace the intellectual life. And the life of mind, such as contemplation, intellect, and philosophy, is the happiest life for human. So in the chapter 8, he discussed deeper about the contemplative life. So in here, he stated that exercising the moral virtues such as courage, moderation, liberality brings us secondary happiness. And these virtues and passion make up our character, and this making us uniquely human. And ano pa nga ba nagpapa-unique sa atin bilang human? Our ability to think and contemplate. And this ability, according to Aristotle, happiness belongs only to those who think. So Aristotle says that animals and other creatures are not cannot be considered happy because they cannot think, according to him. And happiness, contemplative life brings happiness. Kailangan pa rin natin ng external materials such as food, shelter, and everything that is our basic needs, pero not too much. So for the next and last slide, thank you. In here, we will go back to the premise that political art is the highest science. So in here, Aristotle basically discussed and introduced his book and discussion on politics. So in here, he said that public care is the responsibility of the city, and having good laws makes good and happy citizens. This laws is characterized in part by compulsion, which is basically they force us to do something good or sociable habits by threatening us with punishment. And if the public care is absent, the family must take over creating laws in the household, and the family must be the one who will teach the children how to live a virtuous life towards the happy life. So in here, by teaching the young, it helps if the person is born disposed to accept the discipline of being a good person in order for that person to be easily educated. And for the last one, Aristotle suggests that the young must study laws and government and contemplating how this apply in the real life or real world. So that will be all. Thank you for listening. Always remember that it is only through action and habit that we became good people. Thank you for listening, guys.